For coming today. I'm Lisa Ramsey from the Osterville Village Library, and we are pleased to introduce Seth Wilkinson. He's a certified ecological restoration practitioner and the president of Wilkinson Ecological Design. Seth's considered an expert and frequent instructor in the field of bioengineering, ecological restoration, and shoreline stabilization. Seth has been a leader in hundreds of ecological restoration projects for private individuals, land trusts, and municipalities for over 2 decades. As an inventor and pioneer in the integration of bioengineering systems with native plants, Seth and his team at Wilkinson Ecological Designs constantly innovate and improve the practice and integrity of ecological restoration. We appreciate you taking the time today. I'm going to try to get myself out of the middle of your slides, and I will turn this over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so hopefully you can see my screen all right.
Yeah, except I'm still in it. Let's see, hold on.
Okay, well, just a little bit of a summary. Today's presentation will be a little bit more about things that can be done to deal with the consequences of global climate change and sea level rise, rather than sort of why is it happening. That's probably a much longer conversation. So we decided to focus on, how does one go about thinking about these challenges and adapting to those challenges in a way that relies more on nature than structure. So starting with site-specific criteria is a good way to identify how one goes about thinking about these things. If a beach has a really stable base elevation, that is very helpful for us to understand early in the design process, because if there's a lot of cobble, like in that image in the left, and I would note that beach is actually quite sandy in the summertime, but this image is taken in winter, and a lot of that sand tends to move a little bit offshore, and then it usually naturally returns in the spring, like many beaches. But as a result, because it's larger grain size in the form of cobbles and gravels, it doesn't move as much. So that's the type of thing that's really helpful to know early in the design phase when we're determining which type of technique might be most effective. If there happens to be a nearby narrow salt marsh, a fringing marsh, for example, that can really stabilize and mitigate some of these effects of more frequent storms, higher intensity storms, and more sea level rise. Also, you need to be thinking about, does this marsh have somewhere to migrate landward so it can build elevation in response to sea level rise? Because salt marshes are actually rather sensitive to how much salt water flows over them on a daily basis, and how it moves over the site we're finding are very important criteria for salt marshes. And then other sort of nearshore characteristics, like how much open water, which is what we call fetch. So how much is it, miles of open water that waves can build up and get quite large on, or is it more measured in feet or yards? And that has a really important effect on what type of alternative for managing the erosion might be most appropriate, as do depths of water. Waves break when they reach a specific depth relative to their height, and things like sandbars can help to mitigate waves, as you see in that image. It's a sandbar, and you've got bigger waves on one side of the sandbar and smaller waves on the other. Now, sandbars do tend to be mobile. They can move, but that's a good place to start. So those are the types of things we think about when we're trying to determine what's the best alternative. And so what might those alternatives be? And again, this focus will not be on the traditional methods, which you're all probably familiar with. We all see lots of seawalls and rock revetments, bulkheads, the sort of bricks and mortar type of approaches that historically have been used. But as we've had time to observe them, we see, while they can be effective at stopping erosion immediately above them, they generally just reflect that energy somewhere else. And usually the most obvious place that is right in the front, and that's at the expense of the beach. So most seawalls don't have sandy beaches in front of them. And that's because the energy gets reflected back. When a wave hits the wall, it goes in all directions, up, down, right, and left. And when it goes down, it suspends that sediment, and then the waves carry that sediment away. And if you don't aggressively put that sand back in an artificial way, then you will lose that beach. And we see that with rock revetments with seawalls all the time. Lots of examples up and down the Cape. So we won't be talking about those types of methods. We'll be talking about the softer, sometimes called nature-based, sometimes called living shorelines. In my mind, they're all about the same. Sometimes we also use the term bioengineering, but we're talking about all the same types of techniques. And most of them fall into 3 general criteria. And so those would be on the left, sort of a simple plant-based, natural materials that break down usually within 3 to 5 years. So pretty rapidly when you think about the time it takes for plants to get established. Those tend to be used more in the lower energy or lowest energy sites where that is acceptable. And the plants will still have a great chance at getting established, because ultimately all of these designs are relying on the plants in the long term. So that's a really important theme that you'll hear from me throughout the hour here. All we're really trying to use is dead plant materials, natural materials. We use a lot of coconut fiber from the husks of coconuts because it persists longer than most natural fibers, but ultimately breaks down 100%. And by the time it's broken down, then the plant roots and the plant structure should be doing all the heavy lifting. So on the left are the lighter touches, on the right are the heavier touches, where we're using multiple techniques. And in the middle is sort of the middle ground. So I'll go into detail with each one, but I'll start with the one on the left there, as we see highlighted. And I'm going to illustrate each with various designs that we've implemented over the years. I think a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is right at the beginning of a project. So usually the first step is, and I will show that later, is removing some trees and making more of a uniform slope angle, which is easier for plants to stabilize. If you've got a really undercut bank where the slope is much steeper at the bottom than the top, then ultimately gravity will win and the top will start to resemble the bottom. And you don't want your soils and sediments moving around while plants are trying to get established. So nice uniform slope angle is important for plants. So on the top where it says erosion control, blanketing, that's just where these biodegradable blankets are staked using wooden stakes and biodegradable rope over a seed bed that's prepared with native species. And those plants grow up through the blankets. And then at the bottom, what we've done is we've just encapsulated some sand. So we've taken a little berm of sand and covered it with a biodegradable fabric. So over the next few years, that fabric will break down. But if you get some smaller energy waves that interact with that envelope, then it will slowly deflate and take the energy out of the wave. So unlike a traditional structure where you just reflect it and make it someone else's problem and your own beach's problem, this reflects it, or I'm sorry, this absorbs it rather than reflecting it, and then breaks down over time. And by the time it's totally broken down, the idea is the plants above are well stabilized, and those waves can run right up the bank, and the plant root should be able to tolerate that in most circumstances. So plants are really the emphasis here, and this is a detail that we really like because it shows you what's beneath the soil. So those are the types of plants. These are generally actually warm season grasses which migrated out after the last glaciation about 20,000 years ago. These are the same plants that are still grow and were growing then in the Great Plains, the same plants which developed those grade A amazing soils because they took what were already good soils and then they sunk roots down 6, 8, 10 feet even sometimes, And then as those roots decompose, that brings up the organic material, or organic content of those soils, and makes it a really good place to ultimately grow crops. And that's just what we've done to most of our Great Plains, is turned it into agricultural fields. So this gives you a sense. And so over the last 20,000 years, those species migrated from the Midwest out to the coast in the east. And along the way, they selected themselves for salt tolerance. So not all of them genetically would have had salt tolerance, but the ones that made it here along the coastline had some natural salt resistance. So what I'm really talking about is salt spray rather than salt in the roots, which is a different class of plants. And then just for comparison, we have a native bayberry shrub there, which has different root morphology, as you can see. So they don't go as deep, generally about 3 feet, which is still pretty good. It's not 8 or 10 or so, but it's harder. It's more fibrous. And well, our philosophy is mixing those roots together is really the best thing. So some shrubs, some grasses. We don't plant a lot of trees on dynamic coastal banks because they generally grow up tall and become a lever, and they can be more of a liability on the coastal embankment. If there are existing trees there, we'll work around them and try to protect them and make optimize them so they won't wind throw and disrupt the bank. And we have had some projects which have just been geared at saving trees on the bank. So here's a project actually in Wellfleet. This particular project has had quite a bit of press because it's had a very high rate of erosion. And this is what it looked like when we first arrived. I would say this is I'm sort of sharing an example where the sand-filled envelope with the coir blanket was probably not the right approach, but it was the only approach that was permissible at this particular site for a lot of reasons I won't be going into today. But sometimes when it's all you can do, that's what you do. It does work very well in low energy sites. This is not a low energy site, but it is, I think, illustrative from an educational standpoint. So that's what they look like when they first go in. They're just like big tubes. Some people say they think they look like burritos. I don't know why we always use food analogies, but they're just the same sand that's on the bank encapsulated in that fabric to help it resist washing away when waves interact with it. And then we planted beach grass above, and after a short time, you can follow the dates in the upper left if that's helpful. So that was March of 2021. And then, midsummer, late summer, August 6th, the beach grass had taken well, and the envelopes were holding up well. And then the following summer, because these are generally 2 to 3 year design lives for these envelopes in these higher energy sites. So they're still working, they're still doing their job, but you can see a little bit of the lower grasses have been impacted, but the bank is not moving. The top of the bank is the most important if that's your house. So that has not moved, I'm happy to report. But as the winter went on, here we are the day after, or this is Christmas Eve of 2022. And you all may recall the big storm we had on the 23rd. Pretty much deflated those fiber rolls. And again, the top of the bank has not moved, but the bottom has been disrupted. And so the bank will be a little steeper now. So this is probably not a long-term solution, and the owner is trying to find a long-term solution for this site. But we'll be rebuilding those next week until they can find a long-term solution. They're going to have a shorter-term solution. So that is how those envelopes can work. We tend to see them being used in those situations more often than they should. And so I decided to sort of focus on that, but they can be very effective in low energy, gentler environments. So for more higher intensity shorelines, we tend to work with coconut fiber rolls, which are sort of illustrated here. They're just that, as I mentioned, that outer husk of the coconut fruit, I guess it is. There's the nut in the middle, which is mostly edible, where the coconut milk and the coconut water and the coconut cream all come from. And then outside of that nut, there is a fibrous husk, which naturally resists degradation in a marine environment with lots of sun. So salt and sun are what are pretty good at breaking down most natural products. If you look at salt under a microscope, it looks like little razor blades, and it can be pretty effective at cutting through natural fibers. And then you add UV degradation, and most natural fibers break down pretty quickly in these salty, sunny areas that are characteristic of the shoreline. Coconut trees, because they grow in the tropics and they drop their coconuts near the edge of the ocean, and they often float around in the ocean for sometimes years, and then eventually land hopefully on a beautiful tropical beach somewhere, germinate and grow a new coconut palm tree. Makes sense that a coconut husk would be naturally resistant to salt and sun. So we use a lot of them, and it's just the husk is processed and basically pushed into a tube. Their tubes are usually about 10 feet long and about 1.5 feet in diameter, so about 18 inches in diameter, and they can be stacked on top of each other, as you'll see. The anchoring is really important. Many years ago, when we entered into this field, we noticed that it was necessary to increase our anchoring methodology. Fiber rolls have been used on Cape Cod. They were originally used in Europe, and then that technique was brought to the US and really became popular in Cape Cod in response to the 91 no-name storm. So that anchoring methodology initially that was proposed seemed to work pretty well in the 90s. But in the early 2000s, we were seeing that it really was, the performance was going down with these projects, and these fiber roll interventions were starting to get questioned. So we really took a hard look at the anchoring methodology, and we ultimately patented a technique for a much more robust anchoring system, because if you can hold these coconut fiber rolls in place, they can be very, very effective at interacting with the waves, minimizing that wave energy, and also being a great substrate to grow plants. And sometimes we have grown plants right in the coconut fibers rolls themselves. More often, we're now growing them in the seams and then letting those plants colonize the fiber rolls themselves. Ultimately, they're trying to get to the soil underneath. So they need the green parts of the plants above the soil, and then their roots are trying to penetrate down through the coconut fiber, which coconut fiber supports that very well. And then those roots lock all these materials in place and are appropriate in these higher energy sites. So again, ultimately, all those coconut fibers will break down, but the plants should have replaced them at that point. So sometimes we incorporate an envelope, which you can see in the lower left part of the screen. That is similar to the images that you saw in the prior project. The big difference, and this is sort of central to our proprietary method, is that we put the fiber roll on the leading edge so that sand can't wick through the coconut fiber blankets, which you saw forming in those burrito shapes, those cylindrical shapes in the prior project. Sand can pass through those roughly half-inch holes through the biodegradable blankets. And when you put a fiber roll, you really slow that passage of sand through, but still can make it very suitable for plant growth, and also it creates a lot of integrity for the design. So we tend to use that belt and suspenders approach with both the envelopes or lifts and the fiber rolls when we're into our highest energy sites. And please don't try to read the little notes here. That's not the intention, but sometimes it's helpful to sort of see these projects in cross section. So that's what we're showing here. This is without the envelopes. These are just the fiber rolls with the plants. And then those are called duckbill anchors, which are very low profile anchors that have a high holding strength and can be used to hold fiber rolls in place in sort of these moderate energy sites. And then, as I mentioned, here's a cross section showing a similar design, but in the lower portion of this, we've incorporated our lifts to provide more integrity. So it holds more mass together, provides a great matrix for those plant roots to grow down through, and is helpful in holding those fibrils from moving in storms. We've had a number of sites which have gone through very large wave, interacted with 6-7 foot waves and survived that, which is a pretty high amount of energy, and not something that in the 90s anyone, including the fiber roll manufacturers, thought these fiber rolls could be used for. So we've moved that bar and proven that they can be very effective in high energy sites such as this. So I promised I'd show you some before. Here's one of them. This is how a lot of our sites look when we first show up. This happens to be an estuary that's going through some pretty significant tidal fluctuations in response to breaches in a barrier beach system. So it's an estuary, but you can get in a boat and eventually get to the ocean. So you start to get some ocean effect in certain types of storms. And so the cedar trees, which were happily growing there for a long time, now that we're seeing more frequent and higher intensity storms and more water in this estuary, basically, those trees are no longer able to persist at this particular site. So first thing is to sort of get those out of the way. And sometimes there's a fair amount of work recontouring the slope to get that stable slope angle so that we can have a nice long-term protection and a good suitable place for those native plants to grow. Just beyond where the excavator is there to the right, you can see it's a little bit more of a stable project area. So we don't have to do the regrading there. It's just the portions that are undercut. And this is what the process looks like. The fiber rolls are laid out. The erosion, the biodegradable blankets are laid over the top and underneath, and then those anchors are driven in to create a network of harnesses, essentially, that will hold those fiber rolls in place when waves are crashing against this coastal embankment. Pretty early in the process, nearly 20 years ago, we realized one of those changes I mentioned, because when fiber rolls first came, everything we knew about prior to fiber rolls were the conventional methods. So when you're building a rock revetment, for example, you always put a synthetic plastic-based filter fabric behind the rocks, which help to hold the sand behind it. You don't want to just put a bunch of rocks up and then have the sand from the embankment flow in between the seams and cracks of the rocks, and you'd still have your whole revetment caves in, and the bank is still unstable. So you use the filter fabric, very effective on a rock revetment, and that's still used. So naturally, designers and engineers figured, well, we should use filter fabric behind fiber roll arrays. And pretty early, we realized that no, actually, it's probably not a good idea. This is these are already naturally going to resist sand coming through them. And the plastic is slippery, and so you're encouraging these fiber rolls to move in a storm, which you don't want to do. And then if you did get water up over the top and pulling out through, unlike multi-ton rocks in a revetment or a seawall, you don't have anything to hold that water back, and you could actually pull the anchors out if you had a filter fabric, which allows the water to move through more slowly. So that was an important early design consideration, was, no, we really need to go with all natural products here. And I'm happy to say the plastic filter fabric wasn't required. Then we started incorporating, around that same time, we also started incorporating the use of the plant material right in the fiber rolls and adjacent to the fiber rolls, rather than just above, which had historically been how they were used. We want to colonize as much of that coastal bank as we possibly can. Oftentimes the bottom 2 or 3 rolls won't colonize terribly well until many years out, because there's just so much energy down there, so much waves interacting, and that's an area that might normally be more sandy and less colonized by plants. So every site's a little bit unique in that regard. It just gives you a sense of how these look. That's the site I was showing earlier. There's the fiber rolls at the bottom, and then you also need to make sure you stabilize the disturbed soils above. Again, these soils were initially disturbed by erosion, and then we disturbed them a little bit further, and in order to grade it out to a stable slope angle. So just sort of focusing on the area above the fiber rolls, and then just move this. There's our plants. Those are plants that are going to go in there. And so just walk you through that process. Here we are. Again, the fiber rolls are now shown underneath, which has been just covered up with the native soil. The bank sediments were seeded with a special blend of native species that we use that thrive in these coastal zones. That's underneath the blanket, and the blanket is staked in place and held down with a biodegradable rope. And then we add plants, both in the forms of shrubs, as I mentioned earlier, when you saw those different plant root types. We want all of those roots growing together. So in this instance, we have bayberry, little blue stem, and switchgrass. All those roots will interact beneficially with each other. And we generally use a combination of seed and then some smaller rooted plugs to really accelerate the rate at which the plant community establishes. And as you can see, that happens pretty quickly. So those plants grow in. This is taken in the fall or winter, so you can really see the diversity. The shrubs have dropped their leaves, so they're not quite as obvious. You might be looking at those black tubes sticking up. We do generally use a temporary automated irrigation system just to keep these sites from drying out in the first 2 to 3 summers. After that, they don't need any water at all. They'll be fully acclimated. These are plants which grow without irrigation all over the place in the Cape and Islands. So, but a lot of money is invested in these plant materials because we use a lot of them. So you want to make sure they survive in those first formative years of the plant community. So this project was happening in the Pleasant Bay estuary, was going through a lot of changes. So when we started, you can see phase 1 there at the bottom. It was that was the only area that had any erosion. Phase 2 didn't have any erosion, but there was a series of storms. This goes back to around 2010. We took care of phase 1, but Mother Nature wasn't done rearranging the shoreline, so it then destabilized other portions of the property, and the project was expanded by almost 100 feet. And then ultimately we kept expanding it to an adjacent property as well. So presently, I believe it covers about four different properties, 4 different. Well, I'm sorry, I'm using phase 2 as 2 areas of this one owner's property, and then there's a land trust and then another neighbor. So 3 separate properties in all, and it's very successful to this day. Here we are, about 13 years after we started, and this is what it looks like last summer at the end of the growing season. So you'll notice the grasses aren't quite as dense at the bottom. That's in response to storms. There was some storms in the prior winter, and so beach grass got knocked back a little bit, but beach grass is very clonal, so it recolonized this rather quickly, which is helpful. And then that was a fiber roll only project. I had mentioned there's 2 different ways of doing this, and this was our first project on Nantucket, which incorporated the lifts and ultimately led to our patented system. So this is what it looked like before we started. Sort of a cobbly beach. The owner had been, if you have really good eyes, you'll notice that some of the posts of that stairway are new. He was moving it back just about every year in response to the erosion. He'd build the stairway and then have to lose the coastal bank and then have to pick up the stairway and move it back. And he was getting tired of that and wanted to see if he could slow that pace of erosion down. And we thought we could. So we started by sort of building our first lift with a fiber roll in it at a little below the rate of the beach, because sometimes beach elevations will drop during a storm. You may have noticed that if you're walking the beach. Beach might be real high and sandy before a storm, and then after it can be a lot lower. So you don't want your beach to lower too far below the bottom of your fiber roll array. And you can see we're placing those fiber rolls. Those are the coconut husks. Everything there is basically coconut. The blankets that you see are just woven like ropes of coconut that are woven together, coconut fiber. And then the tubes, which are the coconut fiber rolls, are that loose fiber is just stuffed into them. And then we're building the lift in behind it. And then folding it over and basically just building a terrace system up until we get basically to a height where we think we will no longer be interacting with a lot of wave energy. After that point, we're just looking to stabilize. So you can see the stairway is a good reference point here. So the fiber rolls are just underneath the sand at the bottom of the image. And then the erosion control blankets with the seed underneath, which will be planted shortly thereafter. that gets planted, and the site, this site in particular, colonized very well. That was just one growing season. It went from no plants to sort of use that stairway as reference to looking like that. Again, the temporary watering definitely helped because it was a dry summer, but it colonized and became very natural looking very quickly. And again, this is a system that will absorb rather than reflect wave energy, and look very natural as well. And not at the expense of the beach. They've maintained a really nice beach. In fact, the beach has gotten sandier, not rockier, which is what typically would otherwise happen with a hard structure. That project was so successful that a lot more folks on Nantucket wanted to try this. So we decided to go after some even more exposed sites, some higher banks. And you can see this is considerably higher than the last one. And this was a whole neighborhood of about seven different properties. So again, starting with that realignment of the slope angle to get a more stable plant community. And we're using slightly bigger equipment here because it's a bigger bank. And we're building those terraces up using the same method that you saw broken down in the last images. And then again, the blanket goes over, and we often plant very early in the spring when things really doesn't feel a whole lot like spring on the Cape and Islands, but it is. But the warmer weather follows, and the plants come back to life, and you get these nice highly diverse wildlife habitats, lots of different root morphologies to hold the soil together, get pollinator opportunities with the seaside goldenrod and the other wildflowers that are part of that matrix, just sort of going up and down the coast, showing that really great colonization of the entire system. So those are that gives you a little sense of how we address these systems naturally. And then sometimes we start incorporating a planted marsh in different locations seaward of the fibral array, which can also be quite effective. So this is sort of the last general category that we use, but it's been one of our biggest advances in the last 5 years because, and this is particularly in response to sea level rise. So this is we've been doing salt marsh restoration projects to address sea level rise and just general salt marsh loss for well over a decade. But since 2018, the regulatory authorities, primarily DEP and the local conservation commissions, have acknowledged that some sites, especially ones with very narrow beaches, need more opportunities, more tools in the toolbox, so to speak. So they had found it acceptable to incorporate these, what we call cobble reinforced marshes, or CRMs is the acronym we sometimes use. And this is why it can be effective. I just figured out how to get that to go away. This is sort of tying it all together. So you can see the upland in the far left of this. This is just a natural illustration of a natural shoreline and what we would call a more healthy shoreline. So far left, you have the upland, then you have your coastal landform, which is usually a coastal bank, sometimes a coastal dune, and that's well vegetated. And then you have a sandy beach. Sometimes that sandy beach is very wide. In estuaries, it's usually a little narrower, a little wider than a walking path. Sometimes folks make it wider to enjoy the beach at the expense of the salt marsh. Historically, we did that a lot. But that salt marsh, which you see in the middle of the frame there, plays a really important role. And so, the tide line is more or less illustrated there between low and high. So that's the area sort of where the tide comes in. It doesn't usually come and make the beach wet, unless it's a king tide or something, but it interacts. And then that salt marsh plays that important role of protecting the beach area and the bottom of the coastal bank. So if you lose your fringing salt marsh that's illustrated in the upper slide, then you tend to get what's illustrated here in the lower slide. And so without that fringing salt marsh, your beach elevation tends to fluctuate considerably more. And then the that often leads to erosion of the coastal landform, coastal bank. And then that allows that, the beach to go away, beach lowers, that sand might move offshore or move down the beach or up the beach. And then the tide can come in and gets much closer to the coastal landform. That's what tends to exacerbate erosion. So the previous beach elevation was sort of illustrated in there with the red line, and here's the new lower beach elevation. And this is at the heart, we realized, of a lot of the erosion problems on Cape Cod. Is, the major thing that's wrong is, for whatever reason, the salt marsh is no longer there, and everything sort of tends to unspool at that point from an ecological perspective, and then that can have very real, tangible financial implications on the owner. Or if it's, we work with towns, municipalities, sometimes there's a parking lot nearby that needs to be protected. And, you often lose, there's been a number of sites over the years where a town's lost their salt marsh, nobody really noticed, but then all of a sudden the next storm, they lost the parking lot, and then everyone was very concerned. So this slide, which I'm belaboring a little bit, illustrates that very, very important role that fringing salt marshes play to stabilize the landform behind them. So given that, you can't just go to the landscape supply and order up a new salt marsh. Salt marshes are rooted in a peat material, and peat is comprised of organic materials, live root materials, dead root materials, and then sediment. Those are the three primary ingredients of salt marsh peat. And it breaks down very slowly because of the low oxygen or anoxic conditions that are caused by the daily high tides. The high tides roll in, they saturate the soils, the organics tend to hold it. And because there's a lack of oxygen, the oxygen doesn't feed the microbes. And so the microbes are the drivers of decomposition, generally speaking, in these environments. And so peat tends to break down very slowly. So in that respect, one might think, well, sea level rise would be good for salt marshes, right? Because you'd slow that breakdown even more, which unfortunately isn't true. Salt marshes, as I mentioned earlier, have a very low tolerance of change. So if you start to put too much water for too long of a time, it's more the inundation period, the length of time in which these plants are saturated, then the plants actually don't have enough oxygen in the root system, and they will break down and they will die. So their salt marshes are drowning all over the region and in the world in response to sea level rise. And they're trying to move landward. They are adapted to move landward because sea level rise is a natural process which has been happening for thousands of years, but it's never happened, or not recently happened, at the rate it's happening presently, and that is too fast for most salt marshes. So what we're seeing is a loss of the low marsh, and ultimately we may see a loss of the higher marsh species as well, because the marsh is trying to move landward, but it usually can't move quick enough to keep up with that high rate of erosion. So this is a method to combat that. So to preserve salt marshes, which are also very important for lots of recreational and non-recreational fisheries, shellfish. It's a juvenile area for many finfish, many shellfish. So they play a very important ecological role. Even if you might not like spending time in a salt marsh, there's likely some critter that spends a very important part of its life in those salt marshes. And you may want to, pull that fish in on a fishing line or rake it up while you're clamming. And without the salt marsh, you tend to see an effect on the other fish species. So we came up with this method to grow these little salt marsh communities in these pillows, and we simulate that peat bed with these pillows. So we add organic compost to comprise the organic component of a peat bed. And then we add loose coconut fiber to simulate dead roots of the salt marsh plants. And then we naturally plant native salt marsh species, which ultimately those coir fibers will break down, and they will be replaced by what are presently living plant roots. Those will eventually die. And then because of that low decomposition rate, they will persist, and they will help to bind the sediments together, and you'll get peat. Again, you can't purchase peat. You can't dig up another salt marsh, that's illegal. So you have to sort of make the ingredients that ultimately will become peat. So we've developed a pretty, again, this work started well over a decade ago, and we've been advancing it every year. This is just, again, sometimes I like to show things in cross section. Please don't feel like you have to read the fine print, but this is what it looks like in section. We have different ways of anchoring. Sometimes we just use wooden stakes. Sometimes we use the same duckbill anchors with steel cables. If it's a higher energy site, we make a point of not using galvanized metal. So we want that to corrode and break down in a marine system. As we know, untreated metal will break down very quickly in a salt marsh environment, but we're just trying to get it to hold long enough for those plants to get rooted and then to begin that process of rebuilding peat. And this is how it can be used to address that issue, which is illustrated in that first slide that showed the site with and without a fringing salt marsh. So we established this planted marsh. Sometimes we put a little fiber roll on the seaward edge if there's a lot of boat wake or a lot of wave energy. More commonly, we don't. We just plant the marsh. We don't have any anchoring, and the plants often do quite well, as you'll see. But that very important role, that blue dashed line, is representing the average sort of high tide line. And so if that marsh were to go away and that beach were to lower, you can see that blue line would stay constant because the sea finds its own level, and it might start interacting with the bank rather than the marsh. It's supposed to, ecologically, it's supposed to interact with the marsh on a daily basis. It's not supposed to interact with the coastal bank on a daily basis. So that's sort of the very helpful role that marshes play in protecting landforms. This was a community parking lot, association parking lot, I should say, on Martha's Vineyard. And it had fluctuating water levels. Sometimes it was tidally, sometimes what you're looking at on the left is a barrier beach. So sometimes that was breached naturally, sometimes it was breached with heavy equipment, but they needed to flush that water. And now this happens actually pretty frequently in Martha's Vineyard, more commonly than on Cape Cod. But as a result, sometimes this area we're looking at was underwater for very long periods of time, and other times it was dry like this, and that would be seasonally and at different durations for different seasons. That's really hard on plants. They like to have some level of consistency. And as a result, it was also being heavily used, and you just had this dead zone, sort of mud flat dead zone, much lower ecological value. And the erosion was now starting to extend into the parking lot. In the far left by the water, you can see where they used to have vegetation that was stabilizing this parking area, and it was rapidly being lost. So we thought that reestablishing the salt marsh would be the best way to address that. So it started with, again, just a little fiber roll on the seaward edge to help hold things together and combat the waves. And then we built the marsh pillows right on site. We basically one big pillow, again, using all biodegradable materials. Loose coconut fiber there, that's that blonder color. And then you see the dark organic compost. And then the blankets are folded over on the seaward edge to ultimately be folded back over the darker soils and then planted. So there we are, sort of stitching this envelope all together, creating that, again, what you're looking at there between that little yellow box and the mini excavator is where we have simulated peat there. We've created an intact growing medium that will resist storm energy. We had some nice little colonizing plants on the seaward edge, so we didn't work into that area. We waited for them to stop, and because we love to work with naturally occurring plants whenever possible, but there was this persistent dead zone, which is what we focused on. And that was right after planting. So the plants take a little time to knit together, a little bit of care. But in a very short period of time, I believe within 2 years, the site started to grow in. And I was so happy last summer to see it looking like that. Again, that's the water level is up. That's not just high tide. That's either high tide on top of a tidal restriction or just a tidal restriction. But nonetheless, this has now gone through lots of different water level changes, some natural, some anthropocentric. And the plant community is doing really well. That's primarily what you're seeing there is everything that we planted. That's been a very successful project. And with that project, all it took was the marsh to help protect that very important association parking area. And the last project I'm going to show is sort of how you can use these techniques together. So some sites, this is a very high profile project in Chatham, which originally was permitted a rock revetment, and then ultimately that was appealed and was not permitted. So we came up with a non-conventional approach. And this was the first time the cobble reinforced marsh was used in Massachusetts, probably ever. So this basically uses the salt marsh technique with the fiber rolls together. We'll walk through this, and then I'll have time to answer questions for you all. So again, just so you can see it in section view, the salt marsh in this instance, the last instance didn't have any cobblestones because that was a lower energy environment. We weren't dealing with big waves. This is north of Chatham Fish Pier, looking right out at the new 2007 inlet. Feels new to me, having grown up around here, but isn't at this point. So it can receive some pretty significant energy coming in from the ocean, which is just to the northeast of this site. So we need it to be ready with a good sort of base layer. So about half of this envelope is cobblestone and the other half is growing medium. And the idea is those native salt marsh species will all grow and the roots will colonize all that interstitial space between the rocks. So it'll go after all that nice soil between the rocks. And this will resemble what you commonly see along the shoreline in cobbly areas where salt marsh gets established between the rocks and the plants work together to stabilize the shoreline. This is what the site looked like before we started. Another contractor had tried a conventional approach with fiber rolls. The black material you can see is that filter fabric, which used to be used a lot. And then they wrapped like a chicken wire around it, thinking that would help. Nothing helped. The fiber roll array wasn't properly anchored and had that filter fabric behind it, and it failed. And as you can see, there's a lot of erosion behind the site. So we cleaned up all that mess, and we went in and took a different approach, which was, I can't show everything in the same slide because it happens in phases, but underneath the sand, right in the middle of the slide is actually about a 9-foot high fiber roll array. That's very robustly anchored. We actually use the same sort of anchors that hold up utility poles rather than the duckbills that we referenced in the earlier slides. Because again, right off in the distance, you see a little bit of an island to the right, and you see some land to the left, but just beyond the excavator is the Atlantic Ocean, between a barrier beach that you can't really see in this image. So pretty high energy site. So we wanted to be ready for significant storms. So the fiber rolls are under the sand because you've already seen those. And then we incorporated this cobble reinforced marsh, which I'll walk you through the construction of. And we located this right at the base of the fiber roll array because this is a pretty high, we anticipated high elevation waves at this site. So you can see, again, that loose coir and the organic compost, and it's harder to see, but there's also cobblestones incorporated in amongst those. It's one on top there, bigger one. And then these materials are just stitched together, as you can see in this image. And again, that's all biodegradable blankets, and we're creating that peat layer, synthesized peat layer. And so then we plant that envelope, cover it with a light covering of sand, planted the sand over the fiber rolls. So that little strip of sand that you see above there is the fiber rolls. And then you've got the erosion control blanket above with the grass seed just starting to germinate. This is right after planting. And you'll see those little scattered stones. Those are actually there to break up ice. So sometimes ice floats in here, and you don't want very, very large chunks of ice sort of freezing and thawing over a recently planted salt marsh or even an established salt marsh, because it'll pull a lot of those plants out and take them away. So the idea is those rocks will break the ice into smaller pieces as the ice settles down. So they float in on a big tide, they get hung up on the rocks, the water flows out as the tide goes out, and then the ice cracks into smaller pieces, which aren't as damaging. Haven't had much ice so far. This project was installed in 2018, so it's just 5 years old. It's growing in very, very nicely, as you can see in this image. So the fringing marsh in this instance was pushed right up to the base of the steeper coastal landform. In other applications, sometimes we push that fringing marsh out to a little further seaward, and then there's a beach behind that. Every site is unique in its particular criteria and what the goals are of the clients and everything else. But this is a great example of using a naturally occurring high marsh planted in a very intentional way, native species, and we've achieved a very, very stable coastal landform, increased the wildlife habitat, and all the associated benefits of these plants growing on the coastal bank. That was my last slide, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions if there are any.
I have a question, Seth. I would love to ask you. I am very interested in your presentation today. I know of your work because you did a lot of consultation for my neighbors to the west on Seaview Avenue in Osterville. Their name is Webster, and I think you probably know the area. We have an ongoing problem that is caused by 100-year-old pipes that run underneath the wetlands and are broken and were installed to drain cranberry bogs that no one living remembers. And I'm wondering if the objective that I have, which is to somehow create some abatement from the wetlands, which are going to have to be professionally drained. But I'm wondering if some of these envelopes and pillows would be appropriate to put into our wetlands. They're not salt marshes, they're kind of brackish water because they're fresh water that comes very close to the sea, and they're a combination of a lot of natural elements, but they are overflowing. And we are going to have to try to not only pump them out, reduce the water level, which may be an incredible volume of water, find a long-term solution for better drainage in the wetlands. But in the meantime, we're going to have to protect our homes because the wetlands have overflowed to an extent that they are compromising, in my case, my septic system, my utilities, and a whole lot of other things. And I have no natural desire to work in the wetlands, which I know are sensitive and delicate and protected, but I need to have a resource with whom to work to somehow manage the banks of the wetlands so that they do not overflow the way they are overflowing now. Am I making any sense at all? Is this something you might have had experience with?
Sure. I mean, yes, without seeing it's always a little challenging.
I know.
Yeah, I can certainly tell you that the freshwater use of these pillows has been going on even longer than the marine method that we've been working with for a while now. So certainly you can grow, whether they're predominantly freshwater species or more saltwater species or estuarine, which is sort of in between.
Yeah.
Then it should be fine. The other thing is, even a salt marsh species don't require the salt water to thrive. It's a competitive mechanism for them. So even if the salt levels are relatively low, salt's sort of Mother Nature's herbicide. Most plants won't tolerate it, but there's a limited class of plants which we see in the salt marshes which do. So if there's some level of salt, we usually opt towards using what are called halophytic plants or salt-loving plants, which is actually a misnomer, but it works. and so they can certainly be used for reestablishing, I would say, vegetative cover. As far as for absorbing water, they're not going to be able to absorb any more water, any more bigger volume of water than they essentially encompass, which isn't terribly large. So I'm not sure if it would, if I was understanding you correctly, I'm not sure if it would sort of like soak up a tremendous amount of water.
No,
but
I'm afraid I'm being inarticulate. We are faced with, number one, a huge engineering project, which will drain the wetlands back to a more reasonable water level, because right now it's just a gigantic pond and everything is suffocated.
Yeah.
Trees are dead, you name it. What I'm really talking about, and I don't have the technical terms, we'll be working with probably coastal engineering, and we'll be doing some pumping. And obviously everything we might do has to be acceptable to conservation. And you are the guy, because everything you have talked about today is obviously highly ecologically sensitive. But I'm talking about like building a natural fiber berm around the areas where the wetlands have in past overflowed, because it's going to take us 5 years to figure out how to fix the original problem. And we all need protection in the meantime.
Yeah.
Is that something that is half-baked or something you might have done?
No, it's I can't think of a, I mean, we've certainly worked with a lot of berms. And so I think that could work. I'm not sure if we'd have to see the site to determine if the pillows would be necessary for something like that. Because it might not be. You might be able to just use erosion control blankets and intensive planting to stabilize the berm, because that's ultimately, if you just pile up sand, the water will fill up and it'll just move the sand.
Right.
So there's likely some sort of method of either using the pillows and or some combination of biodegradable erosion control blankets with intensive planting that could probably address that. And you're right. I know when you get these old, I think I did see some of the consulting of that project that you're referring to, and yeah, it was intimidating with old broken tile and the response of the.
Oh, it's a mess. And it's really out of control now because a few years have gone by, and that's. I'm fascinated by some of the alternatives that you proposed today. They don't all apply to me, but I'm delighted to make your acquaintance.
Oh, thank you.
Seth, hi, it's Lisa. In the chat, someone asked, can you very briefly touch on the process and list the agencies, groups that you work with to gain approval for projects like these?
Sure. So I don't do well with compounded questions. I'm going to.
Here, let's do the first one then. Can you very briefly touch on the process and list? Let's do that. Just briefly touch on the process.
Sure.
Then I'll give you the rest of the question.
Okay. Yeah. So like the permitting process with conservation. Yeah. So usually, always these projects require conservation approval. And so in Massachusetts, it's a dual approval approach where the local conservation commission is issuing not only their approval under their local bylaw, but also approval under the State Wetlands Protection Act, which is uniformly applied throughout the state. And then most Eastern communities now have bylaws. And so it's sort of a parallel review process. And that's usually all it is if it's an inland wetland or if it's a coastal wetland, but not sort of going into or near the high tide line, trying to simplify this to some degree. As you get closer to the intertidal area, the regulatory authority increases. So you start to get into the Army Corps of Engineers and the another arm of the DEP, which is the waterways license, and other reviews under which can get a little complicated. So I'll probably leave it at that. But as you get closer to the intertidal, you can be up for some more permitting. And then the other agency which sometimes comes into play is natural heritage and endangered species. Typically that's done in parallel with your conservation approval, and their approval is incorporated into your conservation approval. And because we're focusing on ecological restoration, it's not usually a very big hurdle to get over, because that's usually anything we're doing is beneficial for habitat enhancement for rare species, and it might just govern what time of year you can do the project, or some of the methods that you might use. So sometimes that applies. It depends if you're in a mapped habitat area or not. So that's sort of a simplified overview of the permitting process. Typical conservation approvals, can take anywhere between 3 and 6 months.
I think so. You answered the compound question.
Okay. Good.
Thank
Got
you.
lucky. Got lucky.
I don't have any other questions on my end in the chat. Is there anyone on Zoom that has another question?
Nope, thank you.
This is a very tacky question, but just a ballpark range for the project that you did on Martha's Vineyard that protected the parking lot. What does the costs run for something like that? Because that's something that's happening over and over again in different areas of Cape Cod, not just the islands.
Yeah.
The parking lots are disappearing.
Yes.
Then they replace the parking lot, and then the next winter it disappears again. And it just is a continual cost to replace the parking lot. But if you had some ballpark range of what it would cost to do the restoration approach.
Sure. I mean, the most accurate way I can explain that is it's usually in the same sort of ballpark as a conventional measure. So if you're going to use rocks or a wall or something like that, there isn't usually, I'm always amazed at sort of how similar the costs often run, even though they're very, very different approaches. The hard thing about, like, I could give you, a range. I think that project was somewhere in the $75,000 range, somewhere in that neighborhood. It was a number of years ago, so don't hold me to that. But that's really governed by its size, its dimensions. Some of these marsh type species, marsh type approaches, if it's helpful, they might be in the neighborhood of around $600 a linear foot. Again, it depends on the width, but some of the most common widths. If that's helpful.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
I was expecting it to be much higher.
Well, sometimes it is. That was a relatively small project on Martha's Vineyard, but we are working with the town of Chatham. Was at a hearing 2 days ago, project that's been in design for a couple of years. It's an exciting project. It's being funded by the Coastal Zone Management. We're really looking to use, new types of techniques. So we're going to be using a mussel reef. So ribbed mussels, which are common native critters in salt marshes, will be incorporated to protect rapidly eroding peat bank for an existing fringing marsh. And then we're going to also add a cobble reinforced marsh on the landward side, so uphill from the existing salt marsh. So we're both protecting the marsh that's being lost from, and this is one of these ironies. It's one of the reasons it's being lost is because a little tidally restricted creek at Jackknife Beach in Chatham is what I'm referring to. Some may remember the big bridge that was put in there a few years back. So that's done tremendous benefits for water quality and plant species and fish, shellfish species, lots and lots of really, really beneficial project, because they restored the original hydrology to that river, which had been really choked off to almost nothing. But one of the, there's a lot of upsides. There's usually a downside or two. And so with all that additional water moving through, the salt marsh that established when that water had been restricted is now getting really beat up. And it's that salt marsh, to tie this back to your question, that's protecting a very large recreational parking lot that's completely open to the public. There's no sticker, anyone can use it, and it's used heavily. And once that marsh, there's no pavement, this is just a sand lot. And once that marsh goes, the access to that large parking area and all these places where people go boating and sunbathing and everything else, kayaking, paddleboarding, all that would be lost if we lose that marsh. So we're trying to protect it on the seaward side, and then we're also trying to protect it on the landward side, giving that marsh somewhere to go as the tide level increases. The marsh can migrate landward and continue to protect the parking lot. So just to tie it back to your question.
Thank you so much.
Sure thing.
No,
You probably don't want to know the price tag of that one.
thank you so much.
No.
Well, if there's no more questions, this is Lisa again. If there's no more questions, I'm going to thank you, Seth, for taking the time.
Yep.
And this has been a great program, and we really appreciate you making time in your day to come do this for us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.